Chairman. In speaking to part 2 of this bill, I want to highlight in particular the transitional provision in relation to police vetting. Now, Mr. Chairman, the Select Committee spent some time, as I understand it, considering the matter of police vetting, and earlier in the bill, of course, there is a reference in the first part to the new clause 78C B that requires that a board of a state school or the management of a school registered under section 35A that is required to obtain a police vet of a person must apply for the vet no later than 2 weeks after the person begins work at the school. And that amendment to the bill came about as a recommendation from the Education and Science Select Committee, and they had determined that in fact the previous amount of time was too long, and it needed to be shortened so that a police vet occurred within at least 2 weeks of non-teaching staff starting work, and that has been incorporated in the bill. The Part 2 provision, Mr. Chair, is a transitional provision, and I would be interested to know from the Minister what kinds of provisions will be put in place to allow this clause to be implemented, because the transitional provision says that the board of a state school or the management of a school registered under section 35A or a service provider of a licensed early childhood service, as the case may be, must within 4 weeks after the date on which this Act comes into force apply for a police vet of any person in respect of whom they are required to do it, and where one hasn't been obtained previously or for a 3-year period previously, immediately before the commencement of this Act. So, in other words, it is a tidying up clause that requires schools to initiate the process of police vetting within a period of 4 weeks after the date on which this Act comes into force. And the question I have for the Minister is what consideration has been given to the communication strategy that is required in order for this to happen. Clearly, the Ministry of Education, I presume, will be communicating with every school immediately after the passage of this legislation, because this legislation will pass in due course, because Labor is supporting it, despite our disappointment on at the non-inclusion of some clauses which we were particularly keen on. However, it will pass, and I trust that there will be some communication to the schools and institutions that draws their attention with some sense of immediacy to the need to apply for a police vet of any person, particularly where no police vet has been obtained within a period of 3 years immediately before the commencement of this Act. So this is tidying up to make sure all the police vetting processes are in fact in order. Now, this is important. While the question I'm sure the Minister can answer quite readily, this is still an important consideration, and it's one of those parts of legislation that sometimes doesn't receive a lot of attention, but for the assiduousness of officials who are obliged to draw it to the attention of schools. This is important, Mr. Chair, because obviously in this instance a vet is not an animal doctor. A vet, or even an animal doctor who looks after police dogs. but it is a process of, Mr Chair.
Honourable Marion Street.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It is a process of scrutiny and assessment of the fitness of people, teaching and non-teaching staff, who have access to children in our schools and early childhood education centres. Now, nothing could be more important than the fitness of both teaching and non-teaching staff to be in contact with children right up until the age of exit from a secondary school, but to be in contact with these children either in a teaching or a non-teaching capacity. And so the transitional provision does require some assiduous application of the Ministry to advertising this provision to schools in order that they comply. In fact, the Education and Science Select Committee obviously thought it was so important that they would reduce the time from the original 8 weeks that was in the legislation in its first iteration to 4 weeks. And so that requires even speedier compliance than was originally envisaged by the Minister. And I presume from the Minister's nodding a moment ago that she's very much in favour of this shortened time frame. And I can assume that her instruction will be very clear to officials to ensure that not only are the usual communication channels, the gazetting and things of that sort done, but that there might even be additional communication to principals, to boards of trustees, that this is a requirement that needs to be complied with within 4 weeks. And that is a reasonably short order, but it is one of the essential components if we're going to keep our learning institutions for children, our early childhood education centres, our primary and secondary schools safe for the children who attend them. And so the shortening up of this period contained in this transitional provision, Mr Chair, is a good move, I think, by the Education and Science Select Committee. Obviously, they have perceived the urgency of this provision and the urgency of the issue behind it, because there is nothing more important than the safety of the children in our schools and early childhood education centres, and that the process of establishing the fitness of people who come into contact with them, not simply teaching staff, but non-teaching staff also, must be paramount. And so the process that determines the fitness of those people needs to be enacted, it needs to be complied with, it needs to be satisfied in every letter and every respect. Mr Chairman, this transitional provision in relation to police vetting is an essential part of Part 2. There are other parts in Part 2 that my colleagues may well speak to, but it seems to me, Mr Chair, that it's appropriate to draw the attention of the House to the importance even of a simple transitional provision, because it is something that every principal of every school and every chair of every board of trustees needs to know about, so that they can ensure compliance within the shortened time frame. As I say, Mr Chair, Labor supports having a shortened time frame in this compliance period and supports this transitional provision, not only for its mechanics, but obviously for its greater import and purpose in protecting the safety of children in our schools. So, Mr Chair, I think that this, together with the provisions of Part 1, which deal with not only police vetting and not only the appropriateness of teaching staff, but the police vetting of non-teaching and unregistered employees, the police vetting of contractors and their